Hello and welcome. Today I'm going to show you the process from start to finish to doing a painting. The first painting I've actually ever done of my daughter, and this painting just happens to have her rabbit as well. So I am taping down my paper. My paper is really rolled up because I actually buy my watercolor paper in a tube, like a roll. And so I cut it down to size, what size I want, and then I tape it down really good, and then next I'll wet the paper so that it will dry more flat. So I'm taking one of my brushes, just clear water, and just wiping it down. And then I also pre-drew the image on my iPad. But while the paper is drying, I am mixing up the colors that I will need for this painting. So I took the photo for this painting in the front room of our house, which is our dining room on Easter morning. We have a Flemish giant rabbit named Velvet, and she is such a sweet rabbit. She is so special. She is house trained, so she's trained to go in a litter box. And for about the first year of having her, she actually lived mostly inside, especially because the winters in Oregon are so wet. You really don't want your rabbits to get wet because they can't dry out really well. But, so she just kind of hops around the house sometimes. And so I just dressed up my daughter in her Sunday best, which is actually a flower girl dress. And then they were just hanging out, got some cute pictures. So I drew this from the photo I took of the two of them. Now I'm taking some carbon paper and I am just tracing out the outline of the drawing that I created. So I'm transferring it directly to the watercolor paper. And this way I don't have to worry about drawing it and then messing up and erasing it and potentially harming the fibers of the watercolor paper. Because if you like press too hard when you erase, then it can kind of disturb the fibers and then the watercolor paint doesn't really soak in very well. So I got quite a few colors mixed up, so I'm going to start with a really light gold color that I chose, just trying to create areas for all the highlights I will be painting. So like where the light is hitting her dress, and then the bunny rabbit. So I also want to talk about like what inspires me as an artist. A lot of different people are inspired for different ways and reasons. I'm inspired by subject matter and also by the art medium. And my chosen art medium usually is watercolors. And I really love watercolors because you can be really precise with it, but yet you can go through and do things where it's more spontaneous. You just let the watercolor paint do its thing. So that is a lot of fun to do. And so I was blocking in all the light areas, including the areas where like the sun will be coming through. So the photo I took is in the house, but I really wanted this painting like in a forest area, somewhere really green and lush with the sun shining through. And so the direction of light is the same as in the photo I took, so it makes it a little bit easier. I don't have to create my own lights and shadows according to the form of the dress, my daughter, the bunny rabbit, her curly hair. So I'm just building up the layers. And watercolor is really awesome because you can build up layers. So this painting, it took me about 5.5 to 6 hours to actually go from start to finish. So this video is actually sped up a lot. because I'm pretty sure you would not want to sit for 5 hours watching every single brushstroke and mixing the colors in almost what would seem like slow motion compared to this video. So I'm really inspired by watercolor paint. And I'm also, when I first started painting, I was really inspired by my favorite animal, which is horses. Um, I've always loved horses since I was little. And I've actually noticed that my daughter has the same love of horses, which I'm like super excited about. That we have that in common, and she just lights up whenever she sees almost any animal, honestly. But horses are super special. So I have always drawn and painted horses, and I continue to draw and paint horses and other things related to the Western lifestyle. So, like cattle, tack, so the stuff that you put on the horses, like saddles, saddlebags, bridles, just like the whole idea of a Western lifestyle. And I actually can honestly say that I lived the Western lifestyle. One summer, I was working as a horse wrangler in New Mexico at a place called Philmont Scout Ranch, which is a Boy Scout camp. And I worked with like almost, I think there was around 30 wranglers total. And there's about 300 horses there. And we all got divided up amongst like, I want to say, 4 different camps, and the horses got divided up. And I worked at 2 of those different camps. The first camp I worked at was Clark's Fork. There was about, I think, 70 horses there that we were in charge of, and we had to go jingle them in the morning. So we got up before the sun was up. We saddled our horses that we kept at the corral overnight, and then we rode out in this pasture. I want to say it was like 40 acres. Could have been more. But anyways, we called jingling at Clark's Fork Space Mountain, but you could die. Because if you didn't duck for certain branches, yeah, that's a rude awakening. So we would jingle the horses, and then we had the list of like how many people every day that were going to do trail rides, and we saddled the horses and grained them, and then we would do dude rides. So a couple of wranglers, one in front, one in back, and maybe one in the middle, depending on how many people and horses were on the ride. We'd go out and ride the pasture. So we'd keep all the horses in until the dude rides were over. And so I did that for about a month. And then I went on this thing called Cavalcade, which is where there's a Boy Scout troop or venture crew, and they ride a horse instead of hike around. This place, people mainly hiked, but you could ride a horse. And so I got to help out with that. We had a venture crew, so boys and girls were there with adult leaders. And on the first day, we taught them how to ride their horse and saddle it and take care of it and everything for on the trail. So we rode place to place. We had 2 pack horses, so they had like very heavier gear on the pack horses, and then the lighter gear like in their saddlebags. And we rode to places where there weren't anyone else sometimes. We just set up camp and camped there, and then halfway through the week, myself and the leader of the cavalcade, we went to a different camp and got more food on one of the pack horses. So that was quite the adventure. And then after cavalcade, I worked at Poniel, which is, they had around 100 horses, and I want to say about 30 or 40 burros or donkeys. And the kids would borrow the burros and walk for a day with them and pack them. And so we taught the kids how to catch and pack their donkey and take care of them, along with doing the dude rides. And so those horses were actually kept in like a canyon area, and they always came up for food. So jingling wasn't as crazy as it was at Clark's Fork. So in this painting right now, I'm actually lifting some paint where I want areas lighter. So like where some highlight areas would be on her skin. Kind of jumping back and forth right now between the painting and what inspires me. And now I make, since the paper on this painting is bone dry, I'm adding some masking fluid. And so this paintbrush, I put it in my brush soap first to make like a barrier between the masking fluid and the bristles of my brush to help preserve the brush. Because if you don't remove the masking fluid right away, it will like glue your brush bristles together and pretty much ruin it. So I'm just going through right now and preserving the highlights that I want. And if you ever use masking fluid, make sure your paper is bone dry when you apply it and then when you take it off, because otherwise it can rip the paper and smudge the paint. So now I'm using this little stylus that has like a little needle on the end to get the really fine lines of like Velvet's whiskers. So going back to what inspires me. So I got to learn how to pack horses. I actually learned how to shoe horses, so like trim their hooves and pick the shoe size and then fit the shoe to the bottom of the hoof and then nail it in, clench the nail and finish it off with rasping. I understand why farriers, so the people who shoe horses and trim their hooves, why farriers, the ones who do it a lot, are short, because you're bent over a whole bunch. So right now in the video, I'm showing you how I remove the masking fluid from my brush. Now I'm adding some more brush soap to kind of clean the brush out and make sure it stays nice for future uses. So, horses, Western lifestyle. I understand it. We actually got to do a donkey drive, so we heard about 70 head of donkeys over, I want to say, what was it, 10 or 12 miles? I mean, it wasn't like a super long distance, but with that many donkeys, it was going through a town too, so it was a little bit of a process. But once we got down the little road to get to the camp they were staying at, it was pretty easy. So yeah, I like to paint horses, not just because they're pretty, but because I understand, I have an understanding of the Western lifestyle, so that's always inspired me. And now I have my daughter to inspire me as well. Since she was a tiny baby, I haven't really brought out my watercolor paints because I always needed a place to have them set out. And as she grew older, the more adventurous she got. And so she got into everything. So I just mostly stuck to drawing digitally on my iPad because that is what I was able to do. And I was still able to draw and use my creativity, because if you don't keep drawing, you actually lose your skills of being able to draw. Art is a skill you can learn. It's not just for people who have can draw and paint with their intuition, but if you just do something, yeah. So now I'm not just inspired by the Western lifestyle, I'm also inspired by my daughter. And surprisingly, yes, this is the first painting I've done of her. And I've been thinking about this painting long before I started sketching it out. Like, I really wanted to create the moment between my daughter and her bunny rabbit. So I gave my daughter, I think I gave her a couple little pieces of clover so that our rabbit Velvet would hop over and sniff and eat out of her hand. And it was just really special and magical. So I wanted to bring that into this painting. And I'm working a lot with like yellow and purple because they're complementary colors. And I thought that they would look really nice together. And I really wanted them to like pop out of the painting. So like be like the main thing you look at. So that really good focus. So I played around a lot with like high contrast. So high contrast is when you have the lightest light against the darkest dark, and your eye, the viewer's eye, really gets drawn into areas with high contrast. So that was my goal for this painting, was to create that illusion. And I really wanted this painting to like glow. So all the greens and yellows, I wanted them soft and like really blended and like flowing together. And that's the beauty about watercolors, because you can really achieve that with just how watercolor reacts to things naturally. So that's really nice. Watercolors really are special because, you know, like I mentioned before, you can get really spontaneous reactions within the paint itself, and you can just let the paint do its thing and let it flow and go different places where you have the paper wet. And, you know, even though it is spontaneous, there's still some control. So let's say you want the paint to flow in this certain area and not into another area. Well, to achieve that, all you have to really do is only get the one certain area wet, because a watercolor doesn't really go rogue and flow other places unless there's gravity involved and there's a lot of water and pigment, and you know, gravity does its thing, it'll pull things if it's heavy. So I decided this background here needed to be more muted and neutral. So I'm adding like a reddish brown on top of the green, because complementary colors of green is red. And so that would help mute and neutralize the bright colors. So I'm just really doing a lot of wet into wet right now. So it's a nice blended, flowing colors, and just really soft. And so it gives, like, when you look at like photos by professional photographers, there's like this bokeh effect. And so that's what I'm doing with this yellow color I mixed up. I'm just dropping it in amongst the green, and so that yellow color pushes the green pigment around. And now I'm getting some more soap on my brush, the brush soap, to protect it from the masking fluid. And because these areas are just bone dry, I feel really comfortable adding the masking fluid on top of paint that's already is on the paper. And so the masking fluid will preserve the paint as it is now. And so I can paint around it without being super careful and delicate, because the masking fluid will preserve this golden green color. So I'm kind of like doing foliage. So on the left hand side, I'm thinking ferns. On the right hand side, I'm thinking like tall flowers on long stems. And so you can see the masking fluid as I'm applying it. I'm using the little tool with like a little needle or like an awl on the end. It's just something random I found throughout my years of creating art. So I'm just drawing it out, some thin line work with this, because this does really well. And so now I'm like working on the fronds for the ferns. I think they're fronds. And so I just wanted to get that in there before I make more of the area dark, because watercolors, you can lift darker colors depending on the pigment within the paint that you use, because some of the pigments, they are permanent or staining, and so it's super difficult to remove those. So I like to work smarter, not harder when possible, and so I utilize masking fluid. And it really does quite an awesome job. You just have to make sure that your paper is bone dry when you apply it and you paint over it. And then you let it dry, super dry again, like bone dry again, before you remove it. Otherwise, if you apply it or remove it, well, if you apply it when it's damp at all, it can rip up the paper when you take it off. And if it's still slightly damp when you remove it, you can get the paint inside where you're trying to preserve it. So now I'm mixing a darker green because my masking fluid is bone dry, so I can paint on top of it. And you can kind of see where the masking fluid resists this darker paint that I mixed up. It's pretty neat to see how masking fluid works. It's like the same idea as like using like a wax crayon. You can draw with a wax crayon on paper and then paint over it, and then the wax will resist the pigment. It'll just flow right off of it. So now I'm painting over like where the ferns are, trying to have those come up more. The only thing that you need to be aware of when you use masking fluid is like what effect you want to achieve, because sometimes if you do like a lot of really dark behind something really light, it can look like stencils, like cutouts. And so you have to be aware of how you want it blended and how you're going to achieve that later. So moments ago, I sprayed some water because I wanted this to be a really wet into wet area to really blend the colors smoothly together and have it really soft. I'm doing a lot of layers on this painting. This painting took like 5.5, 6 hours total from start to finish. So I'm just dabbing up, there's like some puddles of paint, and so I didn't want those to create kind of weird blooms or cauliflowers. So now I'm splattering some dark paint on the painting as well. Getting some more effects. Just let the paint, the watercolors, do its thing, because that's the beauty of using watercolors. And I'm just like really liking this painting. Her dress is a little bright, so I'll do something a little bit later to help that. So I'm just kind of doing some line work with some darker green to help kind of like blend in, like create some shadows for the areas that I did masking fluid, so that there's like more dimension and make it more realistic looking, because that was the goal for this painting, to have it look realistic, like a little fairy tale realistic painting, a magical moment between a little girl and this little bunny in the woods, with a lot of foliage, because bunnies like to hide in things too. But honestly, this rabbit, she's like the best. Whenever we open up the door to where she lives, she hops over, says hi, and asks for some pets, because she's like part dog, I swear. So I'm working on making some really dark purple to kind of blend together between her dress and the ground, because I kind of want it like a lost edge. So in art, there's these things called lost edges. Where we kind of let the viewer, their mind, like fill in the gaps. Like, you know, the edge isn't clearly defined, but yet you can, like, your mind knows, like, okay, there's the dress is gonna stop there, and then the ground will probably be around there, and it doesn't like draw a lot away from the painting. So where there's like crisp line work, kind of like the high contrast, that draws the viewer's eye to those areas. So I didn't want to have a lot of focus on the back end of her dress. I just wanted your eye to sweep over that without being interrupted, and see the magical moment between the little girl and her bunny rabbit. And cloth is something really different to paint. It can have sharp edges or really soft edges. It's I took like a couple classes in community college, just drawing from life, different cloth draped over things. And shadows really help define shadows and highlights. That's really what it's about. Can really help define the form and shape of things. So I'm working on the right hand side foliage now. I wanted to add some like goldish red blooms, kind of like if you think of like the sun coming through a flower, it kind of has that glowing feel to it. You know, something magical. So just adding in some more of the shadows and just like kind of making like a vignette along the bottom corners to bring your eye into the middle there between the little girl's face and her rabbit. And yes, like I mentioned before, this is the first painting I've done of my daughter. I want to say this painting is probably the second or third painting I've done in 2022. I haven't done very much up to this point. I was just getting back into the swing of things. We had a shed built in our backyard, which serves as my art studio, so I can leave all my paints out now and not worry about this little 3-year-old coming to play with mommy's paints. I mean, she has her own paints, but something about mommy's paints is just so intriguing. Like, I want to be like mommy. I'm going to use her paint. So I have to be careful about that because she's really good about not like eating paint currently, but she's 3. And my paints, they're really not the safest for children. There can be some minerals or chemicals in them that are not safe for little mouths and fingers. So she has her own kid safe paints. But I just wanted to do like a lot of different dark areas in the background and leave light areas so like you can envision like far off in the distance, the light coming through. Like I mentioned before, the bokeh in professional photographers' photos, like the background is like the sun coming through. I do photography as well because I took the picture for this, but I also do it professionally and do family photos and such. So now I am peeling off the masking fluid and my paper is bone dry, so I'm just using my finger to rub it off. And it's actually quite fun. It can be a little messy, but once you get the hang of it, you can like pull up a big glop like that all at once. And you can really see how the foliage kind of looks like stencil cutouts in a way. But I'll show you how I work on resolving that to like make it more blended together and softer and behind my main subjects. So now I'm taking some more paint and going over where the masking fluid was, because I can always darken certain areas to blend it together. Just adding some like green and some gold green to it. So like the sun is hitting back there behind her onto this foliage. You can see the direction of light is coming from the upper right and then traveling down to the lower left. I thought about doing like sun rays in the painting, but I wanted to make it more subtle where the sun was shining from. So adding some more of that goldish reddish brown to the suggested flowers in those the shrubbery, the foliage. And I kind of I'm saving my main subject for last because those are like the little details I want to work on. So every time I let my painting dry, you'll see I push down the tape area. That way I make sure it's a good seal and it'll stay down and help it dry flat better. So now I'm mixing up some skin tones. Going to make her a little bit more pink. So working on her arm, I have my iPad out. You'll see her little face there. Um, that way I can like zoom in on areas. I don't have to like print a photo. I can just zoom in and have it saved to the iPad. And when I was painting her little face, I wanted her hair out of her face a little bit more. Because the hairs are so fine and there's a lot of detail to faces, of course. And I'll be honest, and I feel like I am out of practice of painting faces when I did this one. I should have done like a warm-up painting to get the hang of actually painting faces again, because it is a very specific skill set, and I've taken many years of figure drawing classes, and I've taken a watercolor painting class just for portraits, because you don't just want to add like black to someone's face. You want to make their face glow. You want to keep it like warm colors. You don't want to add like grays or anything, even though it is a shadow area in certain parts, but you want to keep it warm, like fleshy, like a living person. So you want to stay away from like grays usually. So that's one of the classes that I learned. So I'm cleaning out this little palette well because I wanted to mix some more colors. So I'm making like a brown color, brownish gray for the bunny, because she is like a brownish gray with white. This bunny here, her name is Velvet, and she is a Flemish Lop mix. So Flemish rabbits usually are solid colors, but the Holland Lop in her gave her color pattern. You can see in the lower left of the screen her color. I think she's super pretty. She's super sweet. And so I'm working on painting her, and then I'm working on preserving like the hair along the silhouette, the outline of her body, because I envision her kind of being backlit, even though it's not really in the photo because there's a wall there, but I envision her being backlit because the sun's coming from behind them from the upper right. And when I do photography, I really like doing backlit photos as well with natural lighting. So I'm just kind of adding some purple in there, and then the grayish blue, and adding her little stripes. And then I'll use like a grayish blue super light with a lot of watercolor. With a lot of water in the watercolor to do like the shadow part. And then I'm adding the goldish brown along the edges to add like, so along her front end there, on her neck and chest for the bunny rabbit, like reflected light that is bouncing off of my daughter's dress. And I'm working on her whiskers, which I did use masking fluid with. Adding some more little shadow details on the dress and my daughter. Oh yes, her face. Noses always get me. I always paint them like too big or in the wrong place. And yes, I've had many a portrait of very disproportional people's, like their face is extra long because I make their noses long. So yeah, there's a whole thing right there. But I really feel like I did really decently with her portrait up to my standards, even though I've been out of practice of watercolor painting portraits for a couple years now. And this made me think of something else. When I was much younger, when I would draw horses, they had like their legs were rectangles. And if you know horses, their legs are not rectangles. And my horse bodies used to be kind of blocky. But now I've gotten the hang of painting horses. If you've seen my other paintings of horses, then yeah, I've improved quite a bit from when I was younger. So you always have to start somewhere. And it can be scary to start, but if you don't start, you're never going to get there. and it takes lots of practice. I've been doing watercolors, gosh, for about 18 years now, up to this point, and that's over half of my lifetime already. So I've had a lot of practice with watercolors. People portraits, I want to say the past, gosh, 10 years I've been working on them. No, maybe a little bit longer because I was in art school. So I want to say 15 years. But people can be just as difficult as horses to paint. You know, you could be really comfortable painting horses and people could be hard, or you could be really comfortable painting people and horses could be hard. It just really depends on how much practice and time you put into something. Like, I need to put more practice and time in painting little girls because this is the first one I've painted of my daughter. So I did a couple layers where I just like wipe and dab it with a paper towel because I'm like, no, that's not right. And I drew it out, and the drawing looked almost spot on, I'd say, for the photo. It's just the perspective of her face is something that I'm not used to, and so I think that threw me off as well. So like the reference photo itself, it's kind of funny. Like the planes of her face, if that makes sense. So I'm just working on her arm, kind of making the little muscles. Now I'll use the paper towel to pick up any of the wet paint or pigment that I need to do. And adding some more details to her dress. So this dress, I was envisioning it to be white, but it's not white. And I thought, well, maybe I can lift the paint off, but it didn't work out that way. And that's okay. You know, I figured out, you'll see at the end, I figured out a way to make the dress how I pictured it in my head. Watercolors is really about a lot about planning ahead, because traditionally you use the white of your paper for like the white areas, and you keep it really light for where you want like lighter areas. So you work light to dark, because watercolors, you can do multiple layers once they dry between each layer. And if you're really careful of a light hand, you can definitely do lots of layers depending on how thick your pigment is on the paper. And so you can always work up the light areas to dark areas. But it can be more difficult going from dark to light, because some of the pigments I mentioned before, they have a staining or are even marked and rated as permanent. And so you have to be careful about that, like what paints you use, because you can't lift all watercolor paints. So I'm working on Velvet's markings, making it a little bit darker. Just working light to dark, as I mentioned before, because I can always make it darker. And then her fuzzy little ears. And Rabbit's ears, even if they're like gray bunnies, like her, on the inside, they're still going to be a pink, especially if the sun is like shining through them. So kind of like this, it's backlit, so the sun is shining through them, and so it's definitely going to be a little pink. And Velvet's ears are really soft, especially the area between her ears along the top of her neck. It's like the softest spot on every rabbit I've pet before. And some rabbits do not like it when you pet their ears, so be careful. But Velvet has been with us since she was about a month old. No, maybe 2 months old. I forget. Since she was tiny. And so we've always handled her a lot. And so she likes getting petted and she's okay with us touching her ears and stuff, which is important because you need to make sure there's no little ear mites or anything bugging her. So I'm kind of toning down the gold by adding some purple in her dress because yellow and purple are complementary colors. And then I noticed some little puddles forming, so I just used my paper towel. Oh, now you see my daughter. She wanted to come help. And so this is when I pulled out my white gouache. Gouache is an opaque paint. You can water it down so that it's like watercolors. And so this gouache I am using very lightly because I can do it in layers. And because I really wanted her dress like white. So I'm starting on the edges where the highlights are, and then I'll slowly work my way to where the purple is. I'm using it to help flush out the form of the fabric and to, make the dress appear white. I still really wanted like the gold, yellow, and then the purplish blue to come through to help define the shadows. So I'm just slowly building up the layers. And I'm looking at my reference photo off screen to see like how the fabric is sitting. So I can do a couple layers of the gouache on the purple area, and when it dries, gouache usually tends to dry lighter, darker. Oh gosh, I don't remember now. But you'll see the white, it kind of fades away as it dries on the darker areas. So that's why it's really helpful to be able to work in layers, because you can slowly build it up so that you don't do too much at once. And years ago, before I even did this painting, I would have been like, I can't use white gouache because I am a traditional watercolorist who only uses the white of the paper. I'm never going to use gouache. And now I'm really glad that I moved past that mindset, because otherwise, this painting, I may have just kept it in a drawer and never shared it with anyone. And I could have thought that this painting was a failure. But instead, I used my resources like white gouache, masking fluid, and all that to make it a better painting. Even though, it's not a traditional watercolor painting. So I'm just using that gouache to my advantage. And adding a little bit to velvet as well. And I really wanted her dress to like sparkle and shine in the sunlight. So adding some more highlights to really get it to pop out, and doing lots of little line work. And the brush I'm using is a really thin liner or script brush. I actually got it from my grandma's neighbor who used to do ceramics. And so this was her brush. It holds a decent amount of water and paint. And so I don't have to grab paint as often as like a little short bristle detail brush. So I really like this brush for that reason. So I'm getting towards the end. I'm like, well, I need to work on her eyes a little bit more and her mouth, define those features. So I'm using my little short detail brush, and then the little bunny's eye. Make sure I have a highlight in her eye to give her a little bit of life. Just working on all the final details of her dress, so that you can kind of see the dress edge. I still have like the lost edge on the left bottom half of her dress. It's like really soft and subtle there. So I added some yellow to my white gouache for the layers, because I didn't really like how harsh that shadow was. I wanted to soften it a little bit more, because I didn't want the eye to go there. So like the high contrast. So that was like a high contrast with a really dark purple, and then the the layered gouache over the yellow. So I wanted to soften that because I didn't want that to take away from the faces of these two. So just layering more gouache. It's really a process, like to get it just right. It's okay to take your time. And now I'm doing little white gouache splatters to kind of make the dress sparkle. Little sparkle and glow. I really love the little sparkles that I added there. It just adds a little bit of touch of magic. And then working on her eyes a little bit more and little highlights on her cheek to show the light bouncing off of her dress. And then warming up her hands with some really warm reddish orange on her arms and hands and her face. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you're still here watching the whole video, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I hope this inspires you to try something new, to use a medium like I use gouache to make the painting how you want, how you kind of envisioned it to be, and to just get out there, do something. I hadn't painted for a very long time, it felt like, and I was kind of rusty, but you know, I'm not 100% happy with her face, honestly, but I feel like I did a good job. And yeah. And if you want to watch more videos like this one and learn little helpful tips for painting watercolors, please subscribe to my channel. I also have an email newsletter if you'd rather receive emails from me. And if you're on Facebook, I have a Facebook group just for learning about watercolors called Watercolors Made Easy. So I'm just working on more white gouache, of course, because I'm like, you know, it's not quite perfect. Let's work a little bit more. But that's the beauty about watercolors. The paint doesn't dry out. You want it to dry out, and you just add more water and you just keep on painting. Oh, just a little bit more, just a little bit more. All right, now my painting is totally dry, so I'm going to just take the tape off and I'll show it to you. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you guys have a great day and happy painting. Oh, I had to sign my name.